In 1999, Dr. Ufe Fuentes, doctor of the Spanish team COULDN, decided to create a supercyclist, one capable of dominating on all terrains, just as he had already done in the past with Melchior Mauri in the 1991 Vuelta a España, in which he beat Miguel Indurain. But this candidate had to be an all-rounder, good in the mountains, but also good in the time trials. So that ruled out the unsightly climber Fernando Escartin and the young but not outstanding time trialist Roberto Heras. Neither could be that man. The chosen one, a young Colombian who had excelled in the Tour of Romandy the year before, was Santiago Botero. Do you want to know his story? Without further ado, let the show begin. With Ufe at the helm of COULDN's medical operations, the green and white Santi Botero began to make a good start to the 99 season, with a second place in the Vuelta a Andalucía, a fourth in the Semana Catalana, and an especially brilliant third place in the Paris-Nice, where he even won the stage with the finish in Firminy, beating the winner of that week-long loop, the Dutchman Michael Bogart, in a sprint. All was laughter for Botero, the former neighbour of Pablo Escobar in the neighbourhood of Medellin, who, in his third year in Europe, was flying. That was until before the start of the Vuelta a España, where he could have been one of COULDN's top contenders in the fight for the victory, but he tested positive for testosterone. The levels provided by Botero were absurdly abnormal. While a normal person usually generates 1.5 nanograms of testosterone, Botero's levels were between 17 and 29 nanograms, in a range of different anti-doping controls. Until 2006, it was not possible to measure whether those levels were generated naturally or artificially. So Ufe Fuentes quickly came out to defend his rider and assured us that those levels were generated naturally by Botero's body, which must have been a mixture of Sylvester Stallone in Rambo, Bruce Willis in Die Hard, Arnold Schwarzenegger in Total Recall, and Nicolas Cage in Willy's Wonderland. The Colombian had to admit his mistake and ended up being sanctioned for 6 months without being able to compete. But nothing else happened. He would return to compete in May 2000. Despite his discreet results in the Escale Bicicleta and the Dauphiné, the only competitions in which he had participated in that year, the director of COULDN, Vicente Belda, decided to line him up in his 9 for the Tour de France. This was knowing what he had in his hands, a real alpha male that with the care of Ufe Fuentes was going to fly in that edition of the Grand Boucle. Botero, however, did not start the Tour de France well. Between the prologue and the team time trial, the COULDN rider and the rest of his teammates lost almost 5 minutes on the US postal of Lance Armstrong, and in the super exhibition of the Gringo rider in the Dantesque day of Hochelaga, Botero lost more than 12 minutes on the American champion. Although he did enjoy the victory of his teammate Javier Ochoa in the first victory of the COULDN riders in that edition of the Tour. It seems that such a performance greatly motivated Botero, who just the day after losing 12 minutes escapes with the Dutchman of Rabobank, Eric Decker, in a stage of more than 215 kilometers with a finish in Revel. But despite the good speed of the Colombian rider, that year the Dutchman flew and picked up one of his 3 victories in that Tour de France in the sprint. Botero had been close to the victory and he cut 5 minutes on the favourites in the GC, but he was still far away in 30th position. Nothing happened. The next day he rested and Ufe Fuentes would make an epic recharge of his riders, one of whom would become the terror of the Tour de France in the mountainous days. A day later, Botero escaped again with the usual suspects, such as Alexander Vinokourov and Pascal Hervé. It was the stage finishing on Mont Ventoux, and there we would see the first great exhibition of the Paisa in the Tour de France. Despite being in the breakaway most of the day, he was the one who held on the longest at the head of the race. And not only that, but when the group of roosters reached them on the ramps of Mont Calvo, Botero was still as fresh as a daisy, even trying to jump onto Marco Pantani's wheel in the attack that would give him victory that day. As he couldn't catch him, he worked hard to make sure that his teammate Roberto Early, well classified in the general, didn't lose too much time to Armstrong, and he reached the finish line 1 minute behind the gringo. But that display of endurance was nothing compared to what we would see 2 days later. In a day of 249 kilometers, with a finish in Briançon, and with passes like the Var and the Izoard on the menu for the stage, it was exactly on the Var that Kelme launched a group attack, so that their fittest man, Santiago Botero, again made the breakaway. This time, the most epic of his career. Nothing and no one mattered. They climbed the passes of more than 2,000 meters of altitude, and despite not representing the prototype of the slim and tiny beetle, Botero pulled with his arms and kept pedaling with unusual force. And behind, Armstrong and Pantani attacked each other, but such was his pace that they hardly cut anything from the lead of the new superclimber from Colombia. He left the Italian Paolo Salvadelli down on the ground and out for the 10 count, and crossed the finish line as winner. This was after more than 7 hours of effort, and with almost 3 minutes of difference over Armstrong. Botero was already in the top 10 of the general classification, despite the loss of the first few days, and, with the accumulated kilometers in the breakaway, had also placed himself as leader of the mountains classification, ahead of the legendary Richard Virenque. Despite the Frenchman's attempt to cut the gap, as he showed in his victory in the Joux-Plane ahead of Kelme's Roberto Early, Botero defended himself as he had not done before, and arrived with the favourites like Armstrong and Ullrich in the rest of the mountain stages of the Alps, despite the effort that he had made in Briançon 2 days earlier. Botero's recovery was miraculous. So much so that in the Mulhouse time trial he gave his first great sign of being an all-rounder and finished in the top 10 in the discipline, in which 2 years later he would become world champion. Although that is a different story, one that we will tell you about in the future. Santi Botero finished 7th in the overall classification of the Tour, 14 minutes behind Lance Armstrong, and not bad considering that on the day of Hautacam he was more than 20 minutes behind Lance Armstrong. Ufe Fuentes had made it. 3 of his riders had finished in the top 10 of the Tour de France. They got 2 stage victories, proudly displayed the jersey in the mountain stages, and Botero himself climbed onto the podium in Paris as winner of the mountains classification. He was the leader of Colombia in dark years for the sport in the country. A leader who in those years was full of testosterone, because at least he had learned something from his former neighbour, Pablo Escobar.